Welcome to this LinkedIn video with Square One Law. Now, I at Recognition PR have been working with Square One Law over the last few weeks of this crisis to have executive fellowship meetings on conference call over the last few weeks, and we've picked up a lot of information early in the crisis. Ian Gilthorpe, senior partner at Square One Law. The biggest issue has been the coronavirus business interruption scheme. And we have written a document that we sent to politicians. We know that it's got to the senior decision makers about the problems with this scheme. So before we go on to potential solutions, let's summarise what the problems we encountered were 2 weeks ago.
Yes, I mean, I think that there was obviously concern about security, and there was concern about lack of access and how difficult it was to get through the scheme. And I think one of the issues really here has been that this was just the small firms loan guarantee scheme rebadged. And I've always recognised that I thought it needed to change to be appropriate to the current crisis. So it's really good news that they're now reviewing that. And it's much better to have launched in this current crisis and then change it and improve rather than dither and delay.
So the problems we highlighted were guarantees needed from directors. The fact that guarantees were needed was slowing the process down. There was an avalanche of applications and not enough staff at banks to process those applications. And also there were other businesses in the larger area that were also having applications processed. There was a gap between those larger businesses and those smaller businesses at 45 million or less. There was a gap to fill. There was lots of things we represented to the government, and we hope that they're going to address in the Chancellor's statements this issue of banks needing to conduct assessments of conventional bank lending first. Can you explain that?
Yes, and I think that one of the issues with this scheme is that the banks first of all have to assess whether or not they can lend on commercial terms, and if they decide that they can't, they then has to justify that, and that includes taking in any security before they can then proceed to look at what generally are distressed businesses. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been applying. They then have to look under this scheme at validating the long-term future of these businesses, and that's partly because the banks on the ticket are taking on a 20% risk with an 80% government guarantee, but actually the way it works is that the guarantee only applies to the proceeds from an eventual liquidation. And so the banks are actually being required to take 100% of the risk up front at the start. So you can quite understand why their credit teams are having to look seriously at all of these businesses.
Now, between you and I, we have had, to both of us, different companies that we act for or we know being told about not necessarily declining loans, but trimming the amount of loan. I know a company that applied for a £5 million loan was offered £1 million. I know of a company that's applied for a £250,000 loan, absolutely critical to get some manufacturing done, and has just had that stalled in the process, and they need the decision. So it's a combination between rejection and haircutting the loan, so to speak, and also slowing the system down. If the Chancellor takes away this jeopardy issue, takes away this first chance to go to your own conventional banking issue and streamlines the process, will it make a difference in your view?
It'll certainly make a difference, and I think what is absolutely essential is that we get as many companies through this process as possible, through this risk as possible, because companies are so interlinked that if it's all very well if you end up with a small cadre that are the ones that are going to survive, then they in turn will be jeopardized by money in their supply chain drying up from customers, or indeed suppliers not being able to supply to them. So I think what's really important is that we take as many of the business community through as possible. And to be honest, if we end up taking one or two businesses that aren't long-term viable, that's much better than losing businesses because the process is so cumbersome that actually could make a big difference to the recovery.
Now, I know in your team, you've got a lot of talented commercial lawyers, and that's to be expected. But you've done something else. You've recruited a specialist from the banking sector to help review and assess loans in order that when they arrive at the banks, they're match fit, they're ready to be assessed, and it will limit the amount of questions. Tell us how that's working, that review process, and what you're offering.
Yes, I think that what we looked at, having got very closely involved with several of these loan applications, but also many of the other issues like furloughing, like force majeure in contracts. How could we actually assemble a team that would be able to respond to the current crisis? And that really meant setting up something that was worked cross disciplines, and we work very closely with an ex-senior banker who has been helping prep and give input into the customers that are applying for these loans. And I think that it's really important that the business community pull together in that, all of the professionals working with lawyers, accountants, and with people with that specific sort of knowledge, because the credit teams are under an enormous amount of pressure, and for things to be presented to them in a way that they can access immediately with an understanding of what they need is quite clearly going to help speed things through. And there is an enormous volume of applicants, some of whom have already been put off with an experience of this and aren't really thinking to proceed and don't know where to go. But there are an enormous volume of applications that need to be processed over the next few weeks if many companies aren't going to be running out of cash sometime in May. Okay,
so I suppose the message is, if you've got an application in, and many thousands of people on LinkedIn watching this video will have applications in, then if you're just not sure if it's, particularly if it's a substantial application, maybe get in touch with someone like your team just to have a little bit of a review and to check that when it lands on the assessor's desk at the bank, then there is as few questions as possible and it will be streamlined. Obviously truthful, but streamlined.
Yes, and we launched our COVID-19 business response support group yesterday. And I'm very happy to take calls from people and perhaps if we can give some early stage informal help to help them. But I think what we're talking about there is, Graham, the here and now. And I also think we need to keep an eye on the future, because one of the problems with the current scheme is that what you will end up with is businesses that then can't actually take advantage because they don't have the investment of an upturn. They might not be able to buy stock on the terms that they have been so far. What is going to happen when the cliff edge of the end of furloughing happens and suddenly they get all their employees back? So I do think some thought has to be given to what is going to happen and how businesses are going to get access to funding post this terrible time, if all we're going to do is not create a large number of zombie companies that can't then actually help the economy recover. And I think that's something that government need to be giving some active thought to.
Well, Ian, I hope that by the time people are watching this video, the Chancellor will have announced some streamlining, and that the context of your comments will be in light of some changes to the scheme. But in the meantime, the message is, if you're applying for a loan, do it quickly and maybe get it reviewed by a professional. Thank you very much.